a Singaporean auntie walks in. Auntie Karen, real name. She's in for an extraction and she refuses to believe that I'm the dentist and not the nurse. "You so young, girl. You really got the strength to pull my tooth, You go call the real dentist." Communication had always been my absolute superpower. How was this going so wrong? So the next day, my first patient comes in for a checkup. I put my 5 precious years of patient communication training aside and I say, "You got pain or not?" Second patient is in for pain, coincidentally, and I say, "Your tooth spoiled already. You want to save or you want to pull?" My patients love it. And you see all the pieces start to click. I started to see that my real superpower was something that all of us are capable of, and that's meeting people where they are.
Welcome to Every Moment is a Choice. I'm your host, Erika Behl. I invite you to join me as we delve into the lives of inspiring and diverse individuals who navigate life with intention. Living with purpose starts with embracing the power you have in every moment. If you enjoy this episode, don't forget to subscribe. Hello, everyone. I am so happy to have Dr. Damini Chawla with us today. Hello, Damini.
Hello. Thank you for having me, Erika.
Thanks for coming on. So let me tell you, the listener, a little bit about Dr. Damini. Can I call you Damini or Dr. Damini?
Just call me Damini. That's totally fine.
So Damini is an award-winning speaker. She's an author and a dentist who also advocates for the inclusivity and celebration of diversity. She's been raised in India, China, and Australia, and her own life story provides the foundation of her mission, which we will explore in today's podcast. Her clinical practice as a board-certified dentist led her to explore the cultural and personal context in delivering effective care. Dr. Damini now works with millennials, emphasizing the message of meeting people where they are so that they can communicate more effectively and celebrate diversity. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
It's my pleasure.
So let's get into it. I have a ton of questions here in really big font. So you've been telling hilarious stories on stage recently. You've been on many stages and won some awards lately. And you've been delighting audiences with your wit and humor, but also sharing a very important message in the process. We need to fill the listeners in, though.
Sure.
Because hearing about what you've done on stage, they would assume you've been doing comedy or you've been doing speaking all your life, but you're actually a dentist. So you're in the middle of a big career transition right now. Tell us more about that.
Yes, I know it's a little bit nuts because, to go from dentistry to speaking and comedy, it's a big leap. But I think I was always really interested in being on stage. And, I did theatre and dance and debate when I was younger. And then I think, life circumstances kind of meant that I had to choose a really mainstream career. And so I did, and if you're Indian, there's only 3 mainstream careers. You're either a doctor of some kind, you're a lawyer, or you're an engineer, and there's no other 4th option.
Yep.
So that's how I basically was a rebel and became a dentist. And I think for the last few years, I've just had this thing bubbling inside of me that really needed to sort of nurture the more creative side. And I've heard really poetic things about how dentistry is the perfect mix of art and science. But really, if you think about it, do you want your dentist starting to get their creativity out on your teeth? I don't think so. It's pretty scientific and pretty technical.
Yeah.
So I think I just really needed to nurture that part of me. And I realized that, I couldn't have it all. I couldn't continue to do clinical dentistry and be a mum to 2 young kids and nurture that creative aspect. And, you can't walk away from your kids, actually. So they only have
normally.
one mom. Yeah, they only have one mom. So I couldn't just be like, I'll just put this project on hold. So the thing that then needed to be put on hold for me to be able to have the creative outlet was the dentistry. So I've taken a bit of a sabbatical from that. It's an indefinite, I kind of told myself 12 months, and now I'm 11 months into the 12 and I'm having a great time. So now I'm calling it an indefinite sabbatical. So we'll see how it goes. But that's basically, I decided to take the sabbatical not knowing exactly where I was going with this.
Yep.
And then through the process of sort of exploring different events and options, I got on some stages, and then I heard about APSS, which is how I met you. And actually the very first event that I went to was, it was Phil Merry talking about synchronicity. And I'd never actually thought about it or given it much, importance until that point. And then I started to suddenly see synchronicity everywhere, and events just happened and rolled, and stages just came, and and it's just been a really fun journey so far.
That's fantastic. Fantastic. And for those who are listening, APSS is a professional speaking association here in Singapore that we're both part of. And I've seen Damini on stage, as well as in other venues as well. And I have to say, she's amazing. She's delightful. She's great to listen to. So you're talking about, you wanted to explore this creative side a bit, which you didn't feel you could do while you were full-time dentist. How did you actually get started? I mean, you said you went to, you've gone to a meeting or two of APSS, but on which stage did you first find that taste of, wow, maybe this is something I want to do more of?
So it was very, very random. The old condo that I lived in had a group chat, and somebody on the condo group chat put up this message saying that they were putting together a cultural, Kathak is an Indian dance form, and so they were putting together this show that was going to be at Goodman Arts Centre, and they didn't have a budget to pay an MC and narrator. And so they were looking for someone who had experience doing that. And I just thought, well, you know what, why not? Like, this was 2 months into my sabbatical, and I was just like, yeah, why not? And so I put my hand up for it, and it was a lot of work, like a lot more work than I anticipated. But it was wonderful, because I think the minute I got on that stage, it just did something to me. I feel like I really light up inside when I get on a stage. And then I think that was just it. It gave me the bug, and then I wanted more.
Nice, nice. And so then you went on, you found opportunities to get on stage again, obviously. How, these first few forays into kind of going on stage, seeing how people react, was your original intention just to kind of say, I'm going to explore my creative side? Or did you at the same time feel like, I also have a message? Or what came first? The kind of, I like being on stage, or I have a message to share?
I've always known that communication, so even in dentistry, the part of dentistry that I love the most is actually the human element, right? Yeah. So interacting with people, making those connections, and really building those relationships and trust. And so, there's that. And then there's all my friends have always come to me with their problems, or when they need something, or they need to know who the best plumber in Singapore is. It's like every random question that anyone has, I'm their go-to person. And so I think I always knew that I wanted to do something where I could tap into that communication deeper, and have a wider impact through communication. But I wouldn't say that I had a very specific message that I wanted to share. Yeah, it's like I know that I'm eloquent. I know that I can connect with people. And I know that there is a need in people to feel seen and heard and understood. But how am I going to then harness that into professional speaking or public speaking where you can reach a larger crowd and create a shift for them in something that they need to hear rather than something they already know?
Yeah.
Does that answer the question?
Yeah. No, and there is no right or wrong answer, right? I think that's the beauty of exploring, having the space of a sabbatical to explore what you want to do, and understanding that you can match maybe a talent with a message.
Yeah.
And finding both of those things is something that I think a lot of people are thinking about right now. And I know listeners of this podcast and many of my former guests have reached a point in their careers where they're just saying, is this really what I want to do? Maybe I want to do something else. And so they're also grappling with the same exact thing of what's my message and what's my skill? Like, what's my talent? How am I going to deliver that message to people? So yeah, I'm really curious about how you have honed in on the message of, you talked about, you felt a kind of gravitation towards communication with your patients and everything. And there's a phrase that you've used that I find really intriguing, which is meeting someone where they are as a key to better communication. Can you talk a little bit about more what that phrase means?
Yeah, absolutely. So, meet people where they are. On the surface of it, it seems like a really straightforward concept, right? If I'm trying to communicate with you and I understand where you're sitting, what your values are, what your context is, what your biases might be, and what your needs are. If I can understand and be inquisitive about all of those things, then I'm actually much better placed to take my message and convey it to you in a way that you're going to be receptive, understanding, potentially not triggered, and we can have a really constructive communication around me selling you a product or a service or an idea that I have, or, Erika, let's get lunch, let's get pizza today. But if I understand where you're at, I can meet you there and I can say the same thing in a way that resonates with you better, right? And this doesn't mean, I've had a few conversations obviously around the topic. And so people are like, well, does this just mean then you give in to the other person? And no, it doesn't, because you're not saying give people what they want every step of the way, because you're not a doormat, but you're taking your message and conveying it in a way that they can better process and receive it. So that's what meeting people where they are is about.
It sounds exactly like empathic communication, where you are developing empathy to understand what a person's situation is and how they can best receive that message, if I'm hearing you clearly, which probably means we are having empathic communication right now. This is a good example. So you said you've been having conversations with people. Is this in a formal setting? Like what kind of conversations? How are you exploring your message in terms of your career direction as well?
This has been really interesting. So one of the things that, obviously I communicate with people all day, every day in lots of different ways. But one of the things that I'm focusing on at the moment is I'm trying to meet 100 different people that are not necessarily part of my core set of people that I would actually see on a day-to-day basis. So they're CEOs of companies, they're heads of HR, they're people who run their own businesses, entrepreneurs, people I wouldn't normally cross paths with. And, we talk about obviously lots of different things, but there's two main questions that I'm asking all of them. One is, what is your biggest communication challenge? And then the second one is, how do you meet people where they are? And it's so interesting because the wide array of responses that I get from people, it's really helping me shape my message to try to solve for people's actual communication issues.
Yeah. Are there any trends or any particular answers that really stuck out for you?
I would say actually there's 3 main sort of themes, right, with communication. And it ties in and it really feeds the way that I was already looking at it. But the first one is people have their communication challenges are linked with their own internal thought processes. So I've had people say to me, actually, my biggest communication challenge is I worry how people are going to perceive me or how they're going to judge me when I say what I want to say.
Yeah.
Right? So that's the first one. The second one is cultural, right? Like, and cross-cultural communication has been a big part of what I've been talking about. And people have said, actually, you know, in this day and age where we work in environments where we have teams that are so multicultural, you have a European boss who might move over to Singapore and they're meeting people, you know, their teams might be a mix of Indonesians, Malaysians, Singaporeans, Indians, Chinese, and there's certain dynamics in that group, and then this person has come in and they don't understand the dynamic and they have sudden expectations that things are going to follow a certain path, and it throws the dynamic off. And it was interesting because 3 or 4 different people repeated this in different ways, and each one of them actually said, and it made me cringe when I heard them talk to the team, and I wanted to save them, but I didn't know how. And then the third one is actually quite interesting because it talks about, with the cross-cultural, I would say cross-cultural and multi-generational, I would actually probably bucket that together because this whole concept of Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z all working together in a lot of workplaces. So that's another topic that's come up a lot. And then the third one is actually big sort of sales teams saying that even though they're in big sales roles, a lot of them have never had any formal communication training. And so they've sort of said their biggest communication challenge is how to get their teams to talk to each other, but also to talk to external stakeholders in the most effective way, but not just verbal communication. It's written, verbal, and phone communication, because so much of what we do now is not in person.
Yeah.
You know? And so they said, we've had no formal training. We're just learning this on the job and winging it. So it's been really, really interesting having these chats.
That sounds fantastic way of doing the research also on honing your message. So it's benefiting your kind of finding your second half of your career, or whatever you want to call it as well. That's fantastic. So you're doing these 100 conversations, and what I want to kind of go back because we're kind of going through, you know, your sabbatical and how you're finding your message here. But there was something you said, you know, your life experience or your circumstances led to you becoming a dentist in the first place. And I can tell that when you're talking about cross-cultural communication, it's something that's very personal to you as well, not just a intellectual kind of interest. So can you tell us a little bit more if we rewind a little bit through your life and kind of what were the major things that shaped you going back to your childhood?
That's a loaded question.
I know.
That's fine. So maybe I start all the way at the beginning. So I was born in India. And I lost my dad, unfortunately, in a car crash when I was 1. So my mum was 24, she was widowed, and she had a 1-year-old child and very little family support. And so she had to work really hard to sort of make ends meet and provide an education for me. And she did amazing things. You know, she's an incredibly strong woman, and she basically reshaped her life. got a job teaching at the school that she thought she would like me to go to, which was basically the best school in the country. And so she actually did her Bachelor of Education via distance learning once she'd already got the job. And we lived in India till I was 13. And things were not always easy, you know, and culturally it's not a society that's very supportive of a single mum with a child. And so I think there was a lot of pressure growing up to be a certain way and achieve certain things, and any failure on my part was a direct reflection on my mum. And so I think I grew up just knowing that I had to tick the boxes of achievement every step of the way, and I couldn't let the system down, basically. And so when I was 13, my mum actually got remarried, and my stepdad was working in Beijing at the time. And so that's when I moved from New Delhi to Beijing.
Wow.
Which, at the age of 13, just shy of 14. And that was a really interesting experience because I had a certain sense of self and culture. And, you know, Delhi at the time, it was fairly multicultural. The school that I went to, the people that I interacted with, we thought pretty highly of ourselves, you know? And so I never felt like going into an international school at Beijing was any reason for me to suddenly develop self-doubt or question my identity in any way. But when I got there, it was a really interesting experience because culturally it was just so, so different to where I was coming from. And I was exposed for the first time to people from all over the world. My best friend ended up being this girl who was half Swedish, half Korean. Like, I don't think I'd met a Swedish or Korean person up until then, you know? And it just opened my eyes to a whole different way of being and understanding the world. And then from Beijing, when my stepdad, he'd finished his project there, we moved to Australia, which was home for him. So we moved to Perth. And interestingly enough, the transition from Beijing to Perth for me was actually quite easy because I went from this insane setup in Beijing, like it just was unreal. It was like I was living in a movie, to then being at a private girls' school in Perth where people were focused and wearing uniforms and like, you know, everyone was focused on achieving things. So I say it was easy because culturally the transition was easy for me. But I think it was difficult in other ways. You know, when you move countries at the age of 15 and you move education systems and there's new relationships, like familially, that you're dealing with. So that was an interesting time in my life. But I think that whole sort of pressure kind of stayed of performing and achieving and, you know, just staying on top of the grades, being a high achiever, being a perfectionist. And I think it fed through. And I think I mentioned this to you when we were chatting before, but I wanted to go to acting school when I finished high school, right? That was my dream. I wanted to go to NIDA in Sydney and become an actress. And I might have been on Neighbours, but, you know, and hopefully
you never know what will happen.
Yeah, exactly, right? But it ended up, you know, for my mum, because of her context and her lived experience, that was just not even something that she could possibly comprehend, you know. She needed to know that I was capable in her mind of taking care of myself. And that's where I mentioned, you know, life circumstances sort of shaping the fact that I needed to pick a more mainstream type of occupation or education. So yeah, and that's where dentistry happened. So it was very much you want to go to acting school? That's lovely. So you're going to get an education first. And then once you have a real education, then you can go away. And if you decide to sort of walk away from that after 5 years of dental school, then that's your choice.
Yeah.
Which frankly was never going to happen because after you've busted yourself doing 5 years of dental school, you're not going to then suddenly walk away from it.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's how it all happened. That's how I ended up doing dentistry. And then I met my partner while I was at dental school. Mm-hmm. And then I moved to Singapore in 2011. So I had that cultural experience of going from Delhi to Beijing to Australia to Singapore. And then from Singapore, we actually ended up moving to Hong Kong for work, which, I didn't think that culturally it would be different, but it was. Yeah, and so every step of the way, I would say there's been big sort of learning curves around that cultural adaptability and how you fit in and what works in one culture versus another. Communication is really core to who we are as human beings, right? But also majority of human conflict is centered around communication or the lack of good communication. So this is why I feel so strongly about why we need to be thinking about cross-cultural communication, why we need to be talking about it. Because if people can see things about other people's context and they can understand it, even just being cognizant and being a little bit more aware can allow you to communicate differently and achieve better things with less conflict.
Thanks for sharing that. I'm hearing a couple of really interesting kind of themes there. The one is about, career choice at a young age often is not your own choice. It's your parents. Sometimes it's other family members have a lot of influence on that. And so I'm not surprised that, at some point we kind of reflect. Maybe we've been successful in that career that we set out on. But at some point we say, but there's that little piece of me that did want to go to acting school, and maybe that is something I want to explore there. And also the fact that cultural differences exist everywhere, and they're not purely linguistic or what you would think of a big change going from, U.S. to India or something, for example. Of course it is, but even between Singapore and Malaysia or Thailand, Cambodia. I mean, the small nuanced differences. Wasn't there one thing around in Beijing, because you had come from Delhi, which is in North India, with South Indian friends or something, or and people wouldn't even realize. It'd be like, you're all Indian. Come on, Yeah. Of course you get along.
Yeah. And it was the first time actually where I think I was just so thrown by that. The example that you just gave, because when I moved to Beijing, there was very few Indian families in Beijing at the time. And a lot of the other families were, as you said, they were South Indian. And culturally, I had very little in common with them. English was the only common thing. Like our food was different. The way we dress is different. The language, like our mother tongues, are different. The way we see the world, the way we see religion, everything was different. I had more in common with, we had neighbors who were Pakistani, and culturally, actually, we're much, much closer to each other because actually we're the same people in the same culture and the same sort of geographic region. Our food, our relationships, our language, it was all much closer that way than it was with other Indians, and people, like you said, people don't have an appreciation for that often, and I don't think cross-cultural communication is about necessarily sort of solving for the differences, I think it's okay to just recognize differences. And I think somewhere we've gone a little too far in pretending they don't exist. But the reality is that differences exist. And if we see them and we recognize them and we learn to appreciate them for what they are, it stops being a point of conflict. You know, it doesn't need to be a point of conflict. It can be, actually, you and I, we are obviously different in so many ways, but we are also capable of recognizing that and celebrating it without getting caught up in, oh, but we surely can't meet each other where we are because we are so different.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a message that everyone needs to hear when they go to a new place and they are working. I'm going to come out and say it. When all of the, the managers, the bosses come out here to Asia, of which I was one of them. I came out to Asia 16 years ago from America and was tasked with managing a team. And of course, I'm thinking they're all Malaysians. They're all the same. No, they weren't. There were Chinese Malaysians. There were Malay Malaysians. They had a lot that was different, even about how they acted at work, how they viewed a deadline, how they, it wasn't a monogamous, monotonous. There's some homogenous. That's the word. Monogamous. In Malaysia, they're usually monogamous. Wow. Some states have a bit of a different policy. I mean, homogenous. I was looking for the right word there. But yeah, I think that's something that you had mentioned when you're having these 100 conversations and people are saying, I'm just am worried about how people will perceive me. Sometimes, we need to just accept that we're not always going to get it right, maybe. And just say, there are a lot of differences. Maybe I should just be a little bit more curious about what those differences are rather than trying to paint a picture that there are no barriers here.
Yeah.
So I think that's a very interesting message that you're crafting as you move along in your transformation.
Hello, this is Erika. As a listener to this podcast, you'll know I love deep conversations. So I wanted to share something special with you. Something that's been a game changer for me. It's called scenario cards. Now, these aren't just any cards. Each card is a what-if question to help you explore your values, your life, and your choices. I have been through burnout and a massive personal transformation over the last couple of years, and I've used these cards as journal prompts. They've helped me dive so much deeper into understanding myself and finding my compass. I've also used them to spark some of the most thought-provoking discussions I've had with our guests. So I'm thrilled to share that Scenario Cards has partnered with us to offer you an exclusive discount. By using our custom link, you not only get the amazing cards, but you also support our podcast with your purchase. It's a win-win. So why not give it a try? Go to scenariocards.org/Erika. That's ERIKA. And use the code ERIKA10 at checkout to get an extra discount on any of their products. You'll also find all of this information in the episode notes. So go ahead, dig a little deeper, because your purpose is waiting to be discovered.
When we were just talking about your shifts to different countries and everything, you'd mentioned Hong Kong at the very end. Mm-hmm. And what happened in Hong Kong that kind of set up your trajectory for now?
A lot happened in Hong Kong and nothing happened in Hong Kong. So what happened was that we moved to Hong Kong for my husband's job, and we were young. We were 25 at the time. Well, he'd already moved, and I'd moved to Singapore to be with him. And then a few months later, he got transferred to Hong Kong, and he wasn't really in a position at the point to say, oh, I'm not taking that, because, when you're an analyst at a big bank, you don't say no, you don't turn those opportunities down. So he moved, and then I sort of said, look, I'm not comfortable moving countries a second time and being financially dependent on you in another country where I can't work. So Hong Kong don't recognize the Australian dental degree. You have to relicense to be able to work there. there's no point going back and rehashing the whole thing, because I probably should have just said, actually, I'm not doing it because my career is important. But at the time I was like, well, I'm not moving and being financially dependent on you without any formal commitment. So he did the obvious thing and he put a ring on it. And then I had no reason not to move to Hong Kong. So I moved out there to be with him, and I was really happy. You know, I mean, I chose that marriage and I chose that relationship. And I think in so many ways, we've been together since we were 19. And I think in so many ways, he was everything that I wanted and needed in a partner, you know, and I knew that from the age of 19, because he provided the stability, the security, the calmness, the anchoring that I needed in my life, you know, and because I valued that, I made the move over to Hong Kong. And then obviously I couldn't work as a dentist, and I was young and I was very attached to my identity as a dentist, right? And I think when you do something that technical, often you start to attach your identity to your job. And I suddenly had this situation where I was geographically displaced from what I knew, you know, from Australia and from Singapore, where I'd built a life. So I was geographically displaced. I was culturally displaced. I was away from my family as I knew it, like my mom and my stepdad. And then I was displaced from my own sense of identity, which I think was really difficult for me, you know. And at 25, like being a lady of leisure and like doing the luncheons and stuff, like it wasn't who I was, you know. Probably take it any day today, but but back then it was not so attractive. I wanted to achieve and do and be and, you know. And so I think that was really hard, and I took almost sort of 10, 11 months off from dentistry. I studied really hard for the Hong Kong licensing exams, and they were not made for passing. You know, all countries all over the world are really protectionist about healthcare workers. So, and when I failed that exam, actually, I just remember being really broken because I'd worked so hard and I'd graduated from Australia with honours and my patients loved me and I had all these sort of points that suggested I was a good dentist. And yet I'd failed this exam and it made me feel rubbish. And so at that point, you know, I was basically having a psychological breakdown of sorts. We can go into that story if you really want to. But I realized at that point that I really needed to sort of be doing something more constructive. And so I started flying back and forth between Singapore and Hong Kong. So I used to fly here. I used to work for 15 days straight, 7 days a week, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. I was working for the same dental practice that I used to work for before. And they were really accommodating, but I was essentially locuming within the practice. So they had sort of 50 clinics all over Singapore and I would just go to whichever clinic they needed me at. And so while I was working, I wasn't really building a practice the way that I would have liked. Like I wasn't building relationships with patients or building trust, you know, it was just doing the physical transactional dentistry. And I did that for a year and a half. You know, like I said, we were 25, 26 at the time. Rentals in Hong Kong are crazy. So we were renting a place there that my husband was living in that I would spend 2 weeks of the month in. And when I was in Singapore, I would just basically live off of my cousin's couch out of a suitcase. And it was just hard. It was hard because we were living alternate lives, you know. And I think somewhere, for no fault of his, I started to resent my husband's stability that he had because he was living in our apartment with our things, with our furniture and our friends. And, you know, nothing changed for him other than the fact that I came and went every couple of weeks. And actually the couple of weeks that I wasn't there, in a way for him were great because he would get to party and really focus on work, and, you know, it was very little loss. Whereas I felt like I was the one constantly giving and losing in that situation and displacing myself over and over again. And I think eventually it was 2015 when I just said to him, I said, look, I'm really like, I can't do this anymore. You need to move back to Singapore. You need to figure this out. And he did. And, you know, he moved back to Singapore. And then in that time, I'd sort of built a life here, right? Because I was here for half the month, and most 25, 26-year-olds were not married. So I was not hanging around with our friends. I was not hanging around with people who were couples and families. I was hanging out with single people who were partying all the time, you know. And my husband came into this situation, and then there was an expectation that I drop that life that I had built and we suddenly go back to being the two of us. And that was just on a personal level, it was a lot, right? Because then I was being asked to displace myself again to accommodate for this new change, right? And I think there's just, when I look back at it now, there's just so much that I could have done differently, you know, and there's so much that was rooted in poor communication, you know? And I just think really, like, okay, you live and learn, and hindsight's always 20/20, you know? If I could undo certain things or have certain conversations differently, I don't think it would have been as difficult as we made it. So that's what happened with Hong Kong.
I knew the story was there. So I'm so glad you talked about that, because it's a real life inspiration for why you feel this is so important for other people as well. And I have to say, I mean, living here in Southeast Asia for a long time, I've heard of some crazy expat arrangements to like make it work, make two careers work in a family. I have never heard of like a fly in, fly out dentistry arrangement. That's a first.
Yep. Now you've heard it all.
I really have heard it all now. But how difficult it is for couples who are trying to maintain a dual career relationship in a foreign country is, like you said, like there's so many barriers with exams, professional licensing exams, things like that. And you said, if, you know, it was communication that maybe you would have gone back and done differently. What do you think now, knowing what you know now and knowing what you know about communication now, what would you have done differently in that case?
I think a few different things. I think number one, I would have held my boundaries better, sort of stopped to say, actually, this is what's important to me, then understand the context of what's important to my husband. And, you know, for us, the sort of pivotal point in our relationship when things just felt like they couldn't get any worse and we picked it up and we fixed it, you know, we're in a great place today. But that pivotal point was us stopping and communicating to understand that actually we were both working towards the same goal, you know? And I think actually that applies to pretty much any communication, right? Whether you're talking about a work context or you're talking about governments or you're talking about just with a friend, at the end of the day, your end goal often is aligned, right? And if you can then communicate that end goal to each other and you can communicate the intent behind the decisions, right? Because I was attaching so much negative intent to the choices that he was making. And I felt out of control because I felt like they weren't my choices, right? So he chose to take that job in Hong Kong because it was going to be great for his career, and his career being great would allow us a certain lifestyle as a family, you know? It would allow us to have children and send them to the schools that we want to send them to, right? But rather than at that point seeing that as the intention, that shared collective end goal, all I was seeing was he's choosing his career over mine, and he doesn't respect my career, and he doesn't take me seriously. And it was all my own incompletions that were playing into me not stopping to meet him where he was, to understand what his intentions were. Right? So I think that's a really big one for me. And that's something that I try in every sort of communication now, is to be inquisitive about the context of the person who's speaking to me, but B, try to focus on what their positive intent is, right? Where are they going with what they're saying, rather than how does this disrespect me, or how does this not work for me, right? Which I think was very much the overarching theme at that point in my life.
It's so easy to fall into a trap of assuming someone's intentions based on your own kind of lens and perspective that you're looking through. So what's the role of listening? Because, I mean, you're talking a lot about communicating and being curious. What's the best way to listen if somebody is going to share what their perspective is?
I think, I used to think I was a really good listener till I did actually my coaching training. I've learned a lot through that process of learning to be a coach. And I think listening, having checked your own ego and your own judgments and your own biases at the door before you even start the conversation, is a whole other type of listening. Because you can really hear and absorb and be inquisitive about another person when you don't have your own thoughts firing with every word that they say, because it's, like you said, it's so easy. It's your own biases, your own lens, your own experiences, right? And not just that, but then also your own desire to advise them, your own desire to go in and save them from their pain. That's a big one that I struggled with for a really long time, where someone's telling you something awful that's happening in their life and you're just like, oh, what can I do to
I know what you can do.
I just want to save you. Just let me save you from your pain, But that's maybe not what they need. And so if you put away all of that and you really hold space for someone to speak and share, and you allow them to share with you and go through their own thoughts and processes, often people will tell you things you didn't expect, but they didn't expect to be sharing.
Yeah, that's beautiful, because I think most people assume that they are very good listeners. Yeah. Even many coaches I know assume they are good listeners, but maybe I think it's something we can all work on, to be honest. So fantastic. I mean, the range of lessons that I'm just picking up from your story in terms of, finding your voice. I would say a lot of it is around finding your voice and understanding that your message is going to be one that you want to nurture. You want to find, like, what I pick up from not only this interview, but from seeing you on stage, is that you really want to communicate with lots of people. You want to share your message with lots of people. And I do know from having talked to you earlier that you are interested on getting on big stages. Yeah. And so I just wanted to ask you, if TED called you today, the one of the organizers, and they said, listen, Damini, we want you to come on, what would your topic be?
Okay, so if TED called me and said, we want you to be a speaker, I'm going to assume that I'm already an established, well-known speaker, that people have already bought into all the other things that I'm saying, right? And so I wouldn't need to then worry about is it billable? Is it something companies are willing to pay for, right? This is just my message that I want millions of people to hear. It would really be to meet yourself where you are, right? And what that means really is if you want to communicate with other people, you got to first communicate with yourself. You know, I think so many of us are we talked about this whole concept of millennials who have just gone through life just ticking boxes. You know, we've been told what to want for ourselves, how to want it, how to go about it, making career decisions at 16, 17, 18 that were not necessarily our own, but we've gone down that path and we've just tick, 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 you know. And it's left very little room for us to spend time with ourselves. And it's left very little room for us to stop and look at ourselves and look at actually who am I and what is important to me and what is my context and what are my biases and my judgments and lenses that I come in with, right? And what are the things that make me amazing? But what are the traumas and the experiences that I have just stuck inside a locked drawer and put away that hold me back every single day or that get in the way of me communicating effectively with other people, right? I want people to know that it's okay to spend that time with yourself, that it's okay to dig out those bits of yourself and address all the different parts of you so that you can be whole. You know, you don't have to fix it, but you can recognize it and say, this is what makes me act out in X situation, right? We talked about me feeling like I don't do well when I feel like I'm not in control of a situation, right? That's not something I'm going to undo. I'm also not going to be able to control everything, but it's something I recognize about myself. And when I do that, I can approach situations differently. So, yeah, my TED Talk is meet yourself.
I love that. It's so fundamental, right? And it's just so once I hear it coming out of your mouth, it's like exactly. That's exactly what it is. In order to develop empathy, you have to have empathy for yourself.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I would watch that TED Talk. And Ted, if you're listening,
Ted, please listen. Erika's very intelligent.
And Damini's a good speaker. Lovely. So when you talked about, undoing, it's not necessarily you want to learn things about yourself, but not necessarily undo everything. Am I right in saying you just want to understand, have an awareness of sometimes I can be this way, or if I'm reacting this way, it's because of something else I know about myself. Do you think we actually do have to unlearn anything? It's good enough. It's good to know yourself, but what do we need to actually stop doing, perhaps?
Again, this is another really interesting question because, there's two sides to it. There's a part of me that says, actually, I've had to unlearn a lot of like behaviors and patterns and, ways of being. But then on the other side, I would say, I don't think we ever really unlearn anything. I think every experience, every pattern, every behavior becomes a part of our fabric and we hold it in us and we can evolve and grow from it. But I don't know that we necessarily unlearn it. I think the one thing for me personally that I've had to really unlearn, for want of a better word, is decoupling my job from my identity, And I mentioned that before, that for so long I was just so attached to this idea of Damini is a dentist, and actually there's so much more to me as a person. And I have had the good fortune of being able to put that job on sabbatical, on hold, to be able to explore the other parts of me, you know? And so that process, it's an ongoing process, you know, you don't wake up on day one of sabbatical and be like, you know, I have a new identity and I'm not a dentist anymore. And I still struggle with it because people will ask me like, oh, you're a dentist. Why should anyone come listen to your TED talk about meeting yourself when actually your niche is dentistry? Well, because I don't want to talk about teeth, you know, like, would you go listen to a TED talk about teeth?
I don't know.
I don't know. So it's one of those things. So I have those moments where I'm like, oh yeah, actually that's all I know, you know, that's all I am and it's all I know, but it's not true, right? So I think that's the biggest unlearning that I've had to or continue to put into place.
Yeah. It sounds like meeting yourself, to be honest. Yeah, that sounds, I mean, it's growing on me. I love this idea of a TED Talk. Maybe you should start pitching it.
TED.
So apart from perhaps doing a TED Talk in future and spreading a message from being on stage, what else is in your big, hairy, audacious goal kind of bucket? You know, what else do you want to do?
So I was at the Trevor Noah show last night at the Star Theatre, and I would love to be able to have the impact that someone like him has. You know, there's laughter and there's tears and there's everything in between.
Yeah.
And I mean, he was brilliant. I don't think I can ever imagine being anything like him. But, you know, I want to say that that's the plan for the future, to get to stages like that, to be able to move people like that through comedy, you know, not necessarily, oh, let me pull at your heartstrings, but let's talk about the real world and the real things around us, and let's call out differences and celebrate them and be real about them. And let's have a laugh while we do it, you know? So I think that's a big part of it. I'm working on writing a book. I've been thinking about starting my own podcast for the longest time. I have like a full-blown plan and I just keep dragging my heels on it. You know, that's the perfectionist part of me that's like, I need it to be just so to launch it. So there's lots of exciting sort of projects in the pipeline. And I think net, the end goal is to just communicate with people in a way that makes them feel seen and heard and understood.
Yeah.
But then doesn't just leave them with that, you know, it's something that's going to equip people to go down that path and meet themselves and meet others in a more effective way.
Yeah. Sounds amazing. And I pretty much, having known you for a few months now, maybe, and seen you, I have no doubt you're going to get there. Because I just am so in awe of the way you are able to take your personal story and your message and bring it to people in, like you said, in a lighthearted way that makes people think. I think that's an amazing talent you have.
Thank you.
So thanks so much for being on the show. I will include in the show notes ways for people to contact you, for the TED guy to call you and book you on the next
talk. Please call me. I'm ready for you.
We'll include all that so you can get in touch with Damini to work with her some more. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Erika, and thank you for such deeply insightful questions. I loved it.
Awesome.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe